Hi guys, this is a screencast about the dissemination flow of experimental nutrition physiology. So, if you remember this one, this is an outline of the exercise that I presented previously. So this is an outline of the different phases that you're going throughout the exercise and throughout this whole dissemination process. So, of course, depending on when you're listening to this screencast, you will be in different phases of this workflow. But if we kind of go back in time and go back to the time just before you're going to start the exercises and just before you are going into the lab and doing all the practical work, this is where you are. And you are maybe wondering, how should we start this writing process? So how to come about writing this report. And this is what the screencast basically is about. Some tips and tricks on what to do and what not to do and how to structure this whole report. So if we start with the structure of the reports, there are some elements that should be included in this report. And basically this report is mimicking the same structure as we have in all the scientific papers. So if you look in a scientific paper, you'll have the same elements that you will have to implement in this report. The first thing, however, is not usually a part of a scientific paper, and that is the cover page. But you covered that already, so to speak, because it's the same cover page that you used in the protocol. So you just copy-paste that one. Of course, you have to make sure that all the elements are present, that it is the title, the group number, your names, and the UCPH ID number, and a nice picture if you want to. So that is the first thing. You just copy-paste that one. So the next thing is an abstract. So you have to include an abstract of your report. And I'll get back to that in a moment, how to structure that one. The next thing is the introduction. And you made that already again. So that is the same introduction that you used in the protocol. You just more or less copy-paste the introduction from the protocol and use that in the report. You will, of course, get some feedback from Sophie regarding the academic English, and you'll also get some feedback from me as to the more scientific part of it and the more academic part of it. And you should, of course, implement these comments in your new introduction, but else it's more or less the same thing. Then the method section, and again, you've done that already. That is your protocol. So that is all the study design about the subjects, your intervention and your statistics and your variables and all that. So you just more or less copy paste that one into the report as well. Again, you have to change the language. You have to go from future tense to past tense, and you have to implement whichever comments that you will receive from me regarding the protocol. But else you just copy paste that into your report as well. So that is your method section. Then we have the result section. That is, of course, a central element in a report. That is where you present all your results. And of course, again, depending on where you are in this process, you might have some results and you might not have some results. But also when you have results, you have to decide on how to present them. And depending on your own style or the group style, you can choose to have more visual in presentation. You can choose to have both graphs and tables and maybe even some text. And it really depends on what you find is the most feasible way of presenting your results. I like more visual presentation, but that's just my style. But you can choose whatever you want to. But a good mixture is probably the most used approach to presenting results. I'll get back to how to present these results in a minute. So then we have the discussion. And of course, again, it's an important part of a scientific paper that you discuss your results, and you have to discuss your own results related to the literature. So that is what you start out with. Discuss your results and relate that to what has been found in the literature. And because this is a methodological course, you of course also have to discuss the methodologies, the applicability of the methodologies, how the different methods might influence your results or even influence your conclusion. And you also have to discuss some limitations and some sources of errors that has occurred during this whole data collection process. Then we have the conclusion, and again, I'll get back to how to write up the conclusion later on. And the last part is the perspectives. That is not normally something that we include in a scientific paper, but I would like you to actually spend some time on the perspectives, and I'll give you some tips and tricks on how to implement different aspects of perspectives in a minute. So this is the structure of the exercise. Now you can get an idea on how to write it up and see what's been done if you go into a paper from the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. So AJCN is one of the highest ranking nutritional journals that we have. So it is actually a way to find some inspiration as to how to write it, how to build up your both abstracts but also the main text in your report. So I recommend that you find some interesting papers, maybe related to your subject, and find out how it's been done in AJCN. That's actually quite a good place to start. So what about the format of the report? Well, the format follows the same format as in the protocol. So if you go on Absalon and look up the page protocol structure, at the bottom of that page you will find a table where all the formats are listed regarding line numbers, margins, fonts and alignment and all that. So you basically just have to follow that exact same format, but there are some differences. In the report you have a page limit of 8 pages, so you have to write up new pages of code and you have to limit it to 8 pages, but it's excluding the introduction, the method section, the abstract and the references. So apart from these pages you have 8 pages to write. Normally that is not a problem. On the contrary, most groups find it actually difficult to limit it to 8 pages. But if you face that problem, it's probably because you're not strict and to the point. So go back to the text and make the text a bit more strict and you'll probably have no problems limited to 8 pages. Another thing is the appendices. So you have to upload the same appendices as in the protocol, almost, because there are some appendices that you can exclude, and that is the recipe, because you've already done the food processing, so you don't have to upload that. The signed consent you already done, that's not to be changed, and the subs, you don't have to upload the subs once more. But the other appendices you have to upload with the same numbers. The reason is that you probably have to change some elements in these different appendices, depending on the comments that you get or depending on something that you experience throughout the exercise. So you upload these appendices, but exclude the recipe, the signed consent, and the sub. Now, the file naming. From the protocol, I kind of experienced that you didn't quite get what I meant about the file naming, and maybe that's because I wasn't explicit enough and gave some examples about the file naming. So we'll take that once more. So for the report, I would like you to file name it in this way. So the group and a number, underscore, report, underscore, and the version. And the brackets should be replaced with a number. So the brackets should not even be there when you replace them with a number. So an example is group 3 underscore report underscore version 2. So that is the file naming for the report. For the appendices, it follows more or less the same structure: group number, appendix number, version number, and the file type. So again, you replace the whole bracket with whatever information is relevant in that regard. So this could be an example: group 2 underscore appendix 3 underscore version 2.pdf. So that is the file naming, and please adhere to this file naming, because or else I have a very hard time actually finding out what's in these different documents, and I use so much time renaming all your documents. I don't want to do that, so you might as well adhere to this from the beginning, right? You got it? File naming, important. Okay, moving on. So now I'll present the different elements of the reports, the different sections, and some tips and tricks on how to structure them and what to write in these sections. So the first thing is the abstract, and actually the abstract is the last thing that you write. So, but it's presented as the first thing in report, so this is why it's here now, but you write it as the last thing. Is that confusing? No, never mind. So the structure of the abstract. The abstract should include a short section about your background, so 1 to 3 lines about the background, followed by just 1 to 3 lines about your objectives, your main aims, then something about the methods and design. And in that section, you should write something about the study design. That is how the study is conducted. It's a crossover study. How about randomization and blinding, etc. All the information that is crucial to your study design. Then something about the subjects, the number of subjects, the gender, age, BMI, or any relevant information, all the information that you find relevant in order to characterize your subjects. And then something about the methods used in the trial. And in this section, you only present the most essential part of it, only those methods that underline your primary endpoint and maybe some of the secondary endpoints. Then you present the results. and only the main results, that is your primary endpoint, of course, and then some of the secondary endpoints. And which secondary endpoints that you choose to include in the abstract is more or less up to you. It could be those that are most interesting or those that are most related to your primary endpoint. All the exploratory endpoints that you included should not be presented in the abstract. And you most often only report differences. So you never report that in this situation we found this, and the other situation we found that. You more or less present what's the difference between the two situations if you have a crossover study or if you have a parallel study. You can present them as numerical differences and even as percentage differences. Both are frequently seen in abstracts. And then, of course, the main conclusions. And again, you only present the conclusion from your primary endpoint and one or two, maybe secondary endpoints. But the point is that you should only present what is absolutely relevant in terms of your conclusion. Some tips and tricks on how to write this abstract. Well, the first thing is that it must be short and crisp. And I really mean that. Short and crisp. No bullshit, no narratives, just short and crisp. Short sentences, straight and to the point. And you only include the most essential information. All these nitty-gritty little details you never put in an abstract, so it's the most essential information. And you should regard it as a teaser for the rest of the report. So you should think of it in a way that when I've read your abstract, I really can't wait to read the rest of the report. So it's a kind of an advertisement for the rest of the report. It cannot exceed 250 words, but it should not be much shorter either, because if it's very much shorter, you probably lack some crucial information in the abstract. So try to hit around 250 words. And again, you can actually get some very good insights into how to write these abstracts from looking at papers from AJCN. It's not easy writing an abstract. It's actually something that takes some experience, but this is the first crack at it, and let's see how it plays. And I will, of course, give you some feedback so we can improve these abstracts. So the first real part of a scientific report is the introduction. And of course, you already wrote the introduction. That was a part of your protocol. But you are actually free to do some minor changes. And anyway, you have to do some changes based on the feedback that you got from Sophie and the feedback that you might have gotten from me. And as I said, you're free to change certain elements of the introduction based on some of the tips and tricks that I will present here. So, in the introduction, you start by presenting the scientific background. So what is it that we are going to investigate, and why is it relevant, and how could that in any way help either the scientific community or population or whatever? Which kind of problem does this whole area solve? So that's the first part. The next thing is that the background should prepare the ground for the aim, so that the reader understands why the specific hypothesis has been proposed. So you shouldn't make this section too long. Only include information relevant for the subsequent discussion. So it's not a place where you elaborate on every little detail about this area. So you keep it kind of simple and kind of crisp and to the point, and only include relevant information. And in scientific articles, you almost never have a theory section. You only have a short introduction describing the most important literature within the field. Those that are specific for your aim or your hypothesis. So it's not actually theory section that you write. So the introduction leads to your objectives. So you should kind of build up to that point where you're stating your objectives and your aim and hypothesis, and that should really be short and crisp. It should also be very precise and very specific, so that you're not in any way in doubt as to what is actually being investigated. The objective has to reflect what is being discussed later in the paper. So that is actually quite important, that your objective is also what you are discussing later on. And also remember that the objective should be tightly linked to the conclusion. Otherwise, it really makes no sense. So you really have to think about this red thread throughout the reports, that your introduction leads to your objectives, and then your objectives is reflected in the methods that you use and the results that you get, and that the discussion and the conclusion is also reflecting back on your objectives. So that is really important that you create this red thread throughout the report. So the method section, and again, that is something that you already written, but this is your rewritten protocol. So you will get some feedback on your protocol, and this feedback you'll have to implement in the rewritten protocol. And as I said previously, you also have to change the language so that you are going from future tense to past tense. But you're not supposed to change any procedures. If you during the trial are making some changes because you find out that something is not possible, and of course you will make mistakes, and instead of changing the procedure in your protocol, you note the deviations. So you write that you've done this and that is in violation to your protocol. So these deviations that you encounter throughout the experiments, these are really important to document. So now you have done your study, you have collected your data, you've done some statistical analysis, and you are ready to present all your interesting results. And of course, this is a very important section in a good report. So this is the matter. This is what you have aimed at, collecting and presenting your results from your interesting study. And as I've said numerous times before, it's important that you make this as clear and to the point as possible. You can do that actually by structuring your results under subheadings. So you kind of group things together and presenting them under subheadings. That makes them a bit more easy to read. Another thing that you could do is to make a hierarchy of your results, and you should actually make a hierarchy. So you present your primary endpoints first, then the secondary, and then the exploratory endpoints at the end. And you can use tables and figures where you think it's appropriate. And again, you can kind of make a hierarchy here as well, and present your primary and secondary endpoints in tables and figures, and describe the less important results shortly in text. How you present them, whether it should be tables or figures, that is mainly up to both the data, but also, as I've mentioned before, it's based on whatever style you think is more feasible. But important is that you never ever present the same data twice. So if you presented something in a figure, you don't present them in a table as well. You might present them in text as maybe percent differences between two situations, but you never present the same data twice. That's quite important. So you should avoid redundancy. So more tips and tricks. Usually we describe these kind of data as intervention versus control when we have this situation where we have either a parallel or a crossover study like this one. So an intervention versus control. The repeated measurements that you get, they should be presented in line plots so that we can see the progression of these data. But you also have to calculate the areas under the curves, or even the incremental area under the curves where it's feasible, and you present them as well. And you can present them either as columns, or you can present them as numbers in a table. That's primarily up to you. And again, some prefer some visual presentation, some prefer more table-based. But when you are doing figures and tables, it's very important that for the figures that the text is always displayed below the figure, and for the tables it's opposite. You always present the text above the table, so please remember that. And also when you're presenting figures and tables, it's important that you remember the units and the number of subjects, and these two things are things that students often forget for some reason. So please remember this, the units and the number of subjects. What is also important is that you do not conclude or discuss in this section. That is something that I see so often, that you start to either discuss this or in some way reflect upon your results, and you kind of do semi-conclusions on the flow. And that's something that you do not do in this. You present your results objectively. So now you have presented all your interesting results and you're ready to start the discussion. I often find that it's easier if you start by recapping your main findings. Start with something like, in this study we found that, and then recapping your primary endpoint and your main findings, and then compare these to the existing literature. That is often the best and the easiest way to start. But remember that the main focus should be on your results. I often see students using a lot of time discussing other results, and that is of course important, but you still have to remain focused about your own results. These are the important stuff. That is what you created. So remain focused on that and discuss them in relation to the literature. And when you're doing this discussion and comparing your results to other results, use the differences in methods to explain differences if that is relevant. That is often where you can find the explanation as to why there are differences in the results, and that is of course important in this context. You also have to discuss limitations and sources of error in your trial, but these have to be relevant to your study. Do not list all potential sources of error, because there will be a lot of them. Find those that are most important and crucial in terms of your primary endpoint and even your conclusions, and discuss those. And remember to stay positive to your own results. So you created this study, you designed the study, you carried it out to the best of your abilities, so you should stay positive about your result. You've probably done quite a good job. At least you worked hard for this. So stay positive to your own result instead of just putting them down. I see that a lot, students putting their own results down, saying this is a crappy study and we did all these mistakes and so on and so forth. Stay positive, you've probably done quite a good job. So, now for the conclusion, and this should really be short and crisp and no bullshit. Very short, very crisp, and only conclude on your main result, your primary endpoint. All the secondary endpoints, you probably made some discussion throughout the discussion section and maybe even some short conclusions in that, but in the conclusion, the final conclusion, that is where you conclude on your main results. And please remember that the conclusion must be in line with the objective and the discussion. I often find that students are changing somewhat the focus when they are discussing the results and then end up concluding something that is not entirely in line with the objective and the main aim and the hypothesis, and that is really not very good. So please make sure that you keep this red thread throughout the report and you conclude exactly on your objectives. And then the perspectives, and as I mentioned previously, it is often something that is not included in a scientific paper, but I would really like you to do some reflections on the perspectives of your result. And some of the things that you can do is that you can put your research and results into perspective in terms of society or in research or applicability or whatever you think is feasible. You can even use a multidisciplinary approach like Bodil did in her lecture on interdisciplinarity in nutritional research. Try to find out which other disciplines could actually be implemented in this case to elucidate some other aspects of your study. And you could think, if I was to do this over again, would I do something else? Would I include other variables? Would I design it differently? How would I actually go about it now that I have this knowledge that I have? I think that is worth some reflection actually to try to think about this. How would I do it if I have this knowledge that I have now? And also, what is the impact of your study and your results in terms of society, in terms of politics or recommendations or nutritional recommendations or whatever that you find? Could these results impact something? And think out of the box and try to really use your data to something outside the scope of science. Now, references, that is something that is often difficult to handle, and there are some rules and some guidelines that you should adhere to. And one of them is that you always state the references in a uniform and consistent way. So don't change style throughout the reference list. Use the same uniform and consistent way of presenting them. And you could really benefit from using reference tools as soon as possible. Find a good reference tool and use that. You will probably benefit a lot from it when you have to write up your thesis and going on to maybe even a PhD project where you really have to use these reference tools. And that will also help you in making sure that they are presented in a uniform and consistent way. Now, some examiners are very picky about this. They really would like to have these references presented uniformly and consistently. So do it right from the beginning, and you might as well learn this. You can either use alphabetical or numerical references that depend mostly on actually the journal, but also the situation, and either way is right. Normally, we present them numerically, so that they are presented in the order that they appear in the text. But alphabetically, that's also okay. Now, then something about the language. And of course, you should write in academic English. And you have already received probably some tips and tricks from the TUMI on Epsilon, and you will get some feedback from Sophie on your abstract. So really use this to improve your academic English. You should, of course, write in past tense, and that means that the introduction and, most importantly, the method section should be rewritten in past tense. Present tense is only used when there is indisputable evidence for the things that you write, and then we can use present tense. It's very seldomly used, but it can be used in certain situations. So I would like to finish this screencast by presenting some examples from previous years and some of the typical errors that I encounter reading these reports. And most often it has something to do with non-specific writing and bad English, and of course you have to pay some attention to this. Some other typical errors: missing units, that is frequently seen, so please remember to put units on all your variables. Also using commas as decimal separator, that is a Danish way of presenting decimals. In English we are using a full stop as decimal separator. Using non-SI units, for example using kilocalories instead of kilojoules. Now I know that in some journals they use kilocalories, especially the American journals, but in Europe at least we are using the SI unit of joules to present energy, so please use that. Another frequent mistake is starting a sentence with an abbreviation, and that is not something you can do in English. You always spell out the full word if it's the first word of the sentence. And talking about abbreviations, that is often something that is misunderstood as well, or forgotten altogether. So the thing is that the first time around you want to use an abbreviation, you spell it out, and then you put the abbreviation in parentheses, and from that point you can actually use the abbreviation for the rest of the report. Note, however, that in tables and in text you have to spell out the abbreviations as well, because they have to be able to stand alone, so you have to explain these abbreviations. Now another thing is submitting too many pages, and I sometimes see that you do that, and well, there is a maximum limit of 8 pages, as I explained previously, so you really have to adhere to this. And then there's something about the appendices, and you can go back in this screencast to see which appendices are allowed and which are not. So please submit the right appendices. Now I just want to present some examples of non-specific writing so that you know what I'm talking about. So take for example this sentence: we hypothesize that caffeine-containing coffee has an elevating effect on energy metabolism compared to caffeine-free coffee. Now, energy metabolism is a broad term, and it covers many aspects of metabolism. So energy metabolism is just something about energy being metabolized. So what they are aiming at probably in this sentence is the diet-induced thermogenesis, or the energy expenditure as a result of drinking caffeine-containing coffee. So diet-induced thermogenesis would be the specific and the right word to use in this context. In this example, the subject will conduct a 24-hour food record the day before the measurement to ensure that the food intake will be standardized for both measurement days. Now, again, standardized is a broad term, and we have no clue as to what the standardization procedure is in this situation, so that is also non-specific writing. You cannot just write that it will be standardized. You have to explain what that means in this context. And here's another couple of examples. The test subject must be fasting, which means that the last meal should be consumed within 8 p.m. the day before each trial. The subject is allowed to drink water. Now, there's nothing wrong with the subject being allowed to drink water. The problem is that it's non-specific writing, so we have no information as to when the subject is allowed to drink water and how much is allowed. So that is also non-specific writing. Another example, the fermentation may also contribute to energy expenditure. Now, contribute is also like energy metabolism, a broad term. So contribute just means that it affects something, and we have no clue as to whether this effect is a decreasing effect or an increasing effect. So contribute is too non-specific. And here is the last example of non-specific writing. Height, weight, pulse, and BMI were approximately the same. Now, we really try to avoid approximations in science, and what should be stated here is either it's the same or it's not the same. It's not approximately the same, and we of course try to use statistics whenever we can to define or to conclude whether it's actually the same or not. So. And you should of course present the data so that the reader can see what's actually going on. And so the final couple of slides with some examples of just plain bad English. And the first example here, there will be one study subject to conduct the experiment and in addition a backup subject. Well, I surely hope that the study subject is not conducting anything. The study subject should be, the study subject, and then there should be some researchers actually conducting the experiment. This is just probably a sloppy mistake. This one, subjects should be in general physical and mental condition. The researcher estimates are consistent with the overall objective of the study. Well, I have no clue as to what this sentence actually means. So this is actually an example of what happens if you do not read what you actually write. So do yourself a favor and do a peer feedback within the group, and maybe even read out the sentence, read them out loud, so that you can actually kind of taste the sentences and see what if they actually make sense. Another example, no physical activity 12 hours before the intervention takes place. Well, no physical activity, that is very difficult. So physical activity is anything that has to do with muscle movement, so you cannot avoid physical activity altogether, so you have to be specific about this. So this is partly bad English and partly non-specific writing. Another example, additionally, we include a questionnaire on appetite sensation measuring different flavors in the subject during the trial. I have no clue as to what measuring different flavors in the subject is all about, but it sounds interesting. So again, this is something to do with not reading what you actually write. The systolic blood pressure was barely a little higher in the control treatment. You probably get it. Barely is not a scientific term. Either it's a small increment, and that might be, and then you write it's a small increment and you write the actual number so the readers can see. And a little higher, that is also non-specific writing or bad English. It's certainly not academic English. The subject will eat the same meal in both conditions. I hope not. That is disgusting that they will eat the same meal in both conditions. That is what we call Danglish, and when you are using Danish and you just translate it into English, it doesn't have the same meaning in English. So please avoid these things, and again, read them out loud so that you can spot these differences. So that concludes this screencast about the report writing, and when we are going into the next phase, that is when we are pushing through this whole peer feedback workflow, and I will give you some more information on that in another screencast. So happy writing, everybody, and if you have any doubts, you know where to find me, and I will of course try to help you as much as possible without giving any of the answers right away. I'll see you around.